Thank you.
We don't have a lot of time, but I am just, this is a very serious conversation. I'm so honored because we have, he didn't tell me to say this, but we have Sir Mark Malloch Brown, who is with us today, who has, if you've read his bio, know that he has worked in many sectors, in many spheres, all the way from the UN to the UK government, and now he is leading the Open Society Foundation, and so we're going to hear from Mark about some development trends. We have the incomparable Chetna Sinha here, who has been a guiding light and a North Star for the Center for Inclusive Growth for many years. And then we have Dr. Dano Kaberuka, of course, who has led the Africa Development Bank, has led the Global Fund, but is an expert on all things related to Africa and beyond. So the purpose of this conversation is to really think about the collaboration and the various models of impact that we all are thinking about. We approach this from many different contexts, from many different angles. And these three panelists are going to help us understand not only the trends and the models of impact, but also how they intersect and how we can work together. So, Mark, if I may, would you please start us off and give us a sense of the trends around development? How should we be thinking about this from your vantage point?
Well, it's a big subject. And obviously, a week like this in Washington at the spring meetings, there's this massive disconnect between the sense of overwhelming crisis in many parts of the world, of development failing, of increases in absolute poverty on a scale that we have not seen in a lifetime, actually, of mounting debt crises, a whole series of economic implications, part of them caused by short-term events like the war in Ukraine, others by longer-term ones like climate change. So there's a sense of this massive mismatch between officials here in Washington chiseling away to find a few more billion here or there for climate or for poverty, and the sense out there of the need for much greater resources, much greater ambition in terms of addressing these issues. And I think perhaps most important, and I say this now as the head of a human rights agency or organization, even a foundation, even if most of my life was spent in development, there's a sense that our agenda, the human rights agenda, has become first a development agenda because economic and social rights have become, for so many people in the world, trumped at this point political rights. You can't eat democracy, as the president of Zambia said last week at a summit on democracy. You've got to address these pocketbook issues of economic security for people. But it's kind of worse than that, because this sense of going backwards has meant that issues that we hope were kind of banned from the development conversation, or at least marginalized in it, are coming back front and center, and that is particularly security and conflict. It's very, very hard not to look at the world at the moment and say the trend is it's going to get more violent, there's going to be more state breakdown, there's going to be more authoritarianism in the world, and behind it more inequality and more climate refugees. So, I find us, having to sort of dust off the manuals, if you like, on mediation, on conflict, on security, issues that summits with titles like Inclusive Growth had an implicit optimism about them, that those were yesterday's issues. I suppose the message I have today is they're back.
That's sobering and interesting. Dr. Kaberuka, let me come to you. Mark has been talking about the issue, the relationship really between development and national security. As you think about your work coming out of the Africa Development Bank, and obviously with the Global Fund and the incredible knowledge network that you bring to the conversation, how is COVID, or how did COVID shift, or did COVID shift the priorities when he's security, climate change, inclusive growth, national security, all these? How do you prioritize?
Thank you. First of all, let me say that I totally concur with Mark's point. We don't have time to go into the details. I think I want to ask you, each time you think about inclusive growth, to think about the policy, and therefore to think about politics. The problem in the world is not growth as such, although there are some challenges. Many countries are growing at 10%, 9%, not creating jobs or not creating an equitable life for the citizens. That is the problem. And that is not about technical knowledge. It's about political power and how it is shared in our societies. But we can come to that. The second point I want to say, following on Mark's point, is that 4 things matter for me when I think about inclusive growth. Number 1 is the right to life. Millions of people in the Sahelian region of Africa at the moment, challenged by climate change, by some of the highest demographic rates in the world, are now challenged by security, things which you know very well. And that is the first right to inclusion. And related to that is the issue of learning outcomes. I want you to think about this. We have, for the last 30 years, chased numbers. So many kids at school, so many kids at secondary school. But we now have to worry about the learning outcomes. That will make them be included in our economies. There are 90 million kids now in parts of Africa who are unlikely to reach their full potential, and they're at school. That's the issue of learning outcomes. Now, the third one is when you ask me about pandemics. So I started off as Minister of Finance of my country, spent some time there. Then I ended up heading the African Development Bank. Then for the last 4 years, the chair of the Global Fund. So I've learned a couple of things about pandemics. First thing is that when the world was confronted by COVID, it was defined in an issue of global health security. And therefore the machinery was up trying to find vaccines, trying to find solutions. And when vaccines were found initially, they were available only to countries who produced them. Many of us in the global south, even when we had money, we struggled to get the vaccines. All right? So that is one thing you have to think about. So what is global health security? And how does it link with global health equity? So is Ebola something for global health security? Is HIV/AIDS now an issue for global health security? Is malaria an issue for global health security? Is tuberculosis? No, they are not. Because they are no longer problems for wealthy societies in the north. There are problems for poor people in the global south who are marginalized. And when you have marginalization in education outcomes, health, and I will say nothing about access to energy. We talk about 800 million people with access to energy. It is true, but we then mean just a bulb. Access to energy, I call it energy for production. Energy so you can run a machine for fruits at home, not simply a bulb. When you describe access to energy as not simply a bulb, the numbers are over 1 billion. So when you combine issue of jobs, poor learning outcomes, global health security, global health equity, security, lack of access to energy, there is inclusive growth. And it's about politics.
Well, this all comes home, that this all sort of boils down when you get to Chetna, because these two gentlemen have described what this means regionally, globally, contextually, out of the banks, at the global level and at the continent level. Chetna, you're Mandeshi Bank, you're at the front lines. So the women of Mandeshi are experiencing all of these issues and having to raise their families and experience and raise the community. So talk to us about, I've heard you say development with dignity, but what does it mean when you hear these two perspectives?
So let me take you to directly from Washington to the village where I work, and let me share the lessons. Not I give, but I listen to women and I get those lessons. So I would like to share one thing. I mean, immediately after COVID, many women actually had to take care of their economic problem in the house because men lost the jobs. There was nothing available in the house with the lockdown. And so they wanted to start the businesses. And we started providing loans for mobile phones. Now it came to women to buy mobile phones and to take loans for that. Everybody thought that poor people will not be able to afford smartphones. So they said, we'll get you a feature phone. And our women said, no, we want smartphones. And why? They said that whenever we do digital transaction, we want to get messages. And they said not SMS because we cannot read and write. We want a voice SMS, right? So they are not just talking about access, they are talking about control. And they are not just talking about development, but they are talking about dignity. And when you invest in these women, and when they did the transaction, they got the voice SMS, and you know what they said? They said that never give poor solutions to poor people. They are smart, right? And Shamina, as you always say, that this is in design. And we have to design for poor women, our women. They will not only think about themselves, they will think about community. They will think about the globe also. And while you invest in them, what would be the impact? When these women, they said that give us smartphones. And they very proudly said that we cannot read and write, but our daughters are going to become a computer engineer and we are paying fees for them. Thank you.
So that's an interesting perspective, Mark, in terms of how Chetna and Mandesh are thinking about being inclusive by design. And so as we think about the relationship between security, development, design, talk to us about what that means from your perspective. We have climate change, we have financial inclusion, we have sustainable development, all of these things happening all at once. How do you prioritize, and how should we prioritize?
Well, ultimately, I look at what we do as a foundation as falling into two buckets, really, what I call patient capital and urgent capital. And the patient capital is those long-term investments with partners, many of them very locally based, who over time are building institutions, either their own institutions or those of their communities, and who, need the predictability of a partner who's with them throughout. And the criteria for us in choosing those partners are really twofold. It's one, who are the legitimate, authentic voices close to the ground and their communities and their countries. And secondly, who from that platform are articulating bold visions of future change. Because for us, the patient capital spend is really about, seeking out, or having our grantees seek out what the new world is going to look like. I think behind what Donald and I particularly were saying is a sense of a current political order which has run out of steam. It's failed. It's fallen on by under its own weight. The sort of small government, big global markets model simply isn't delivering solutions to today's problems, either at home or globally. And so, we are investing in trying to find those thinkers, social movements, institutions, which are going to seed that future world order as it emerges, the post-neoliberal order, to use the phrase some would. With our urgent capital, we're trying to kind of make sure that during this period of transition, people are not unnecessarily hurt. So we're doing a lot on debt at the moment because there are a couple of dozen potential sovereign debt crises ahead of us. And left to their own devices, the officials who write those debt restructuring deals leave the burden of the adjustment on the shoulders of the poor, to pick up points we've just heard. And so, trying to kind of improve those deals to offer governments the advisors they want, to add ambition to what they demand of the institutions in Washington, and at the same time pressing the institutions in Washington to be more progressive, more enlightened in how they think about this restructuring. It's the kind of, if you like, interim thing we're doing. I use a development example. I could have equally used examples from many other areas of the sort of human rights and democracy frame that we look at. So, you know, in sum, as a foundation head, I view a foundation as being able to be a risk taker, an early mover, a patient mover when it takes it. So we either move fast or we move patiently and long term because we don't have the pressures that commercial or governmental organizations have to produce results tomorrow or before the next election. And nor do we have, and we can take risks that those institutions can't take because they've got shareholders or voters who won't forgive them. I've got a very tolerant donor who does forgive me, usually. And so, you know, I think, you know, we've got to find our different places where our different advantages lie going forward.
Thank you for that. Chetna, I'm going to give you the last word. So I'm going to go to Dr. Kaparuka, Donald. You've made this, so we're all different sectors here. You made the switch from finance minister to Africa Development Bank to Global Fund. Give us a leadership lesson or two that we should also be thinking about as we make these transitions and prioritize.
Well, it's good you're giving Chita the last word because I think she'll have the answer for that. No, so what I've learned that resources are important. And I think the world today does not lack resources. Larry Summers has told us many times that as the global north ages, the rate of savings increase. This is what happens. In Japan, even at negative interest rates, you have increased savings. And that will happen because of the demographics. But then you have South Asia and Africa, where this opposite happening. This is where the development will come from. Now, how we intermediate the increased rate of savings in the north and the need for savings and investment in the global south is the biggest challenge of our time in terms of capital flows. The problem is we don't have tools and mechanisms to do just that because pensioners in the north are looking for ways in which their savings could be used productively for impact, but also for a return. People in South Asia and Africa are struggling to get resources, and hence you have this crisis on debt. Now, these demographic shifts are real, and they are permanent. So we need to get now the new leadership of the World Bank, the new leadership of these institutions, to figure out mechanisms, not simply through capital markets, maybe foundations like yours, Philanthropy, how we intermediate this issue, which I think is the existential issue for the future. Look at how, I'm just speaking the case of Japan. The former governor of Bank of Japan was a colleague of mine, was leader of the Asian Development Bank. He did great things with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in trying to push back consumption in Japan. It has taken a long time, okay? That is going to happen in Europe. So I think what we need in terms of capital intermediation is that mechanism. Number two, and this last, is about digital. Now, COVID has done damage to our foundations, but has accelerated some processes. Children in many parts of the world had to learn at home using digital. Now, think of the millions who did not have access to internet. How were they learning? And so we need now to figure out how we ensure that inclusive growth, all right, takes place in the digital world using technology which is available to all of us. For me, I think if we could find intermediation for capital flows between the aging societies, the young societies, and then equal access to digital, we could make a dent on inclusive growth in meaningful ways.
That's a perfect segue to you, Chetna. So last word to you.
So as you mentioned about the digital and as you mentioned, Sir Mark, about the capital, I would say that, when you invest in women, and particularly women who are working day and night, and as we did together about, supporting women entrepreneurs, what we saw was that when we were thinking that we will impact 1 million women entrepreneur, first generation women entrepreneur by 25. But by taking loans, doing digital transaction, doing e-commerce, these women, in 23, we are celebrating 1 million women entrepreneur. 23. And it's patient capital, of course. It's investment with dignity, yes, but it is a courage of our women. And what our women say? That if courage and capital comes together, today we are coming to 1 million women entrepreneurs, but now our women are talking about building the 500,000 brands. So women think, and the lessons I learned from them is, again, I would say another, that they always say that our courage is the capital. And I would say that their courage is our capital, right? Inclusive growth. Right? Thank you.
We have to leave it there. Courage and capital. Thank you, Donald Kaberuka, Chetna Sinha, Sir Mark Malik Brown. Thank you.
Thank you.